Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And now I'll recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way Americans consume media and the variety of content available to them has grown significantly over the past decade. In addition to traditional television and radio, consumers are using their phones, computers, smart speakers, and tablets to access a variety of programs, podcasts, and videos. And today, anyone can become a producer of content. Over 400 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute, and over 1 billion hours are viewed every day. Last week, a woman in D.C. posted on Twitter a short video of Marines running to help residents in an apartment fire a few blocks from here. News organizations quickly started using the clip in their on-air stories, and 2 days later, the footage was used by the Marines in a tweet about the heroic efforts. And this is the dynamic world that we live in today. But at the same time, it's important to remember that not everyone has equal access to the latest technology. It's too easy to focus on the benefits of broadband, new media, and multitude of cable and satellite TV channels and forget how many people lack access to such opportunities. And this includes lower-income families and seniors. According to the FCC Commission's 2017 Media Industry Report, 11% of television households relied exclusively on over-the-air broadcast service. That's 12.4 million households, 1 million more than the year before. According to the National Association of Broadcasters, over-the-air reliance is higher among low-income families, and for these families, paying for cable may take a back seat to feeding their kids. Meanwhile, broadband, which is necessary to access a growing wealth of educational, social, and entertainment content, also faces an economic and age divide. According to Pew Research Center, only 45% of people making less than $30,000 and 50% of people 65 and over are home broadband users. Even when you add mobile broadband users, a significant divide still exists both in adoption and the quality of the experience. So as good as smartphones are, they don't provide the same functionality or experience as a large screen device. The Communications Act focuses on certain timeless principles when it comes to media, and those are localism, diversity, and competition. In the modern age, broadband access should be added to that list. Whether it's watching videos for school projects, taking educational courses at home, engaging with friends and family, applying for a job, or utilizing government resources, broadband is becoming a necessity for all Americans. And having broadband available in your neighborhood isn't enough. Consumers should be able to afford the cost of the service and equipment necessary to use the tools of the 21st century. Unfortunately, the current FCC has been actively undermining these principles for Americans. Chairman Pai eliminated the FCC net neutrality rules, which protected consumers, small businesses, and free speech. Net neutrality protected competition and access to the media content which is the focus of this hearing. But those protections are gone now. Chairman Pai also proposed to roll back the Lifeline program in a way that could cut phone or internet service for approximately 8.3 million people. And Chairman Pai's actions are not the way to promote access, localism, diversity, and competition. In the area of media ownership, Chairman Pai sided with corporations over consumers and loosened TV ownership rules in ways that undermine competition. The changes encourage more consolidation and less local and diverse viewpoints. And I encourage the FCC to change course and focus on what's important to consumers. For example, the FCC should rethink its bizarre, and I say bizarre, proposal to unwind its safeguards designed to protect children watching broadcast television known as the KidVid rules. The rules require that broadcasters provide 3 hours of quality educational program per week on their free over-the-air service. And 3 hours out of the 105 hours of core program in a week, I mean, is that too much to ask? Apparently, Chairman Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly think so. For the 12 million over-the-air households without access to cable programming, I don't think so. For the millions of low-income families without access to broadband alternatives, I don't think so. And I appreciate Jeff Corwin being here today to discuss his experience producing children's programming and the impact the elimination of the KidVid rules would have on broadcast children's programming. And I also want to thank our other witnesses for appearing before us to discuss the changing media market. And I yield back at this point, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks the ranking member. That concludes member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. So we want to thank all of our witnesses here today for being here. We appreciate you taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements, followed by a round of questioning from the members. Our panel for today's hearing will include Mr. Craig Moffett, who is the founder and senior research analyst at Moffett Nathanson Research. Welcome, sir. Next, we have Mr. Ian Olgerson, research director at Kagan and Media Research Group within S&P Global Market Intelligence. Welcome, sir. And next, we have Mr. Jeff Corwin, wildlife biologist and executive producer of ABC's Ocean Treks, here on behalf of the Lytton Entertainment. Welcome, sir. We appreciate you all being here today and for preparing testimony for the committee. We will begin with you, Mr. Moffett, and you're recognized for 5 minutes for purposes of an open statement. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank Chairwoman Blackburn and Ranking Member Doyle and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Craig Moffett. I'm the founder of Moffett Nathanson. It's a media and telecommunications research firm. I want to emphasize my personal focus is the physical distribution side of media. That is cable operators, satellite operators, and telephone companies that operate the physical infrastructure for media distribution. I've spent 30 years in those industries. I won't go through my bio, but it's appended. One of the most popular aphorisms in media is that the media industry has seen more change in the past 5 years than it had in the previous 50. Never mind whether that's accurate, it's a call to action, and as a call to action, it's a pretty good one, the argument being change or be left behind. But before getting too breathless about how revolutionary all of this is, I want to focus my remarks on two of the most important trends, the emergence of so-called virtual MVPDs, and also the trend toward vertical integration, like AT&T and Time Warner, through a decidedly less revolutionary lens, and that is microeconomics. I want to start with the emergence of the MVPDs. The appeal of cord cutting is simple. It's cheaper, and some might argue that it's also about greater consumer control or a step toward a la carte. But the real appeal is simpler than that. A bundle of cable networks from an MVPD with a handful of set-top, or from a traditional cable operator with a handful of set-top boxes can typically cost about $100 a month, and the most popular MVPD packages are typically about $40. The problem here is that the programming itself doesn't cost any less to produce just because it's being delivered over the internet, nor is it any cheaper for the aggregator, in this case a virtual MVPD, to buy the content from the content creator. In fact, the virtual MVPDs usually pay more for their content. Nor is it any cheaper to deliver by virtue of being delivered over the internet instead of so-called linear cable. Remember, the underlying infrastructure remains precisely the same. And in most cases, it doesn't even avoid the need for a set-top box. It simply shifts the set-top box from the traditional provider to someone like Apple or Roku. When there is no underlying technology or business model reason why the new service is cost advantage relative to an old one, it pays to be wary. But that said, the services themselves are actually cheaper, so the obvious question is why? Partly it's because the packages are smaller, but mostly it's because these services are being sold to the consumer at zero or negative profit margin. There's an old saying among economists that when something is unsustainable, it will eventually stop. And I guess the real question, as we observe this as economists, is whether the practice of selling these services for a loss will actually turn out to be sustainable. But it is clear that all of this is about keeping pace with Google and Facebook. Their monetization model for these new services is not to make money on selling video, but to make money on selling advertising. it suggests that we're likely to see one of two outcomes. Either Google and Facebook will come to dominate video distribution in a model that's based on highly targeted advertising, and that raises obvious questions about privacy, or the prices of virtual MVPDs will rise significantly to become self-sustaining. And in the process, these distinctions between old and new won't look as significant. A few remarks on the other trend that I mentioned shaking the media business, and that is vertical integration. There's been widespread speculation that we'll see a wave of vertical integration to follow Comcast's acquisition of NBCU in 2010, and that speculation has obviously only grown with AT&T's acquisition of DirecTV in 2015, and now, of course, Time Warner. It's important to view the trend toward vertical integration through the lens of broader migration of what I would refer to as closed media systems, and consider where that's likely to take us. Closed systems dominate almost every important aspect of digital life today. Apple is a closed system, once written off for dead versus PCs, but it is now an iOS universe. Facebook is a closed system, so is Uber and Google. And what we're seeing in the media business is a migration toward closed systems where someone like someone like Netflix produces all their own content and sells it to their own consumers, and in the process requires enormous scale to amortize risk. I would suggest that appears to be where we're headed with the digital platforms, and the real question will become, for the traditional media companies, are they forced to go in the same direction? And if so, these ideas where every cable network, for example, is made available to every distribution platform will be very difficult to sustain in the face of the emergence of these kind of very large closed systems like Netflix, like what could potentially be Amazon and others. I'll leave my remarks there, given the time.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Mr. Moffett, and now I'll recognize Mr. Ian Olgerson for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Bilirakis and Ranking Member Doyle, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share information for this hearing. My name is Ian Olgerson, and I'm an industry analyst with Kagan, a media research group within S&P Global Market Intelligence. We provide market commentary, industry benchmarks, and analysis with a particular focus on the changing media landscape. I've been analyzing the U.S. multi-channel market for nearly 20 years. In that period, we've seen online distribution fundamentally alter how consumers access content. Alternatives to legacy distribution for video and audio have clearly altered business models as well, and the corporate landscape is shifting in pursuit of increased scale. A pair of recent events nicely illustrate the movement. Comcast's premium bid for Sky in the UK and Amazon's much more subtle enhancement of its Fire TV recast streaming media player in very different ways offer insight into the direction of media. Legacy providers like Comcast and AT&T are doubling down for increased scale on delivery and content, while innovators are giving consumers greater access and control of programming outside of those traditional subscription offers. While the majority of U.S. households still maintain a traditional multi-channel subscription through a cable, telco, or satellite service, often referred to as MVPDs, online alternatives have eroded the value of the classic big subscription package, driving declines in overall subscribers. Traditional multi-channel subscriptions have fallen from their peak levels of nearly 102 million in 2012 to fewer than 94 million at the end of 2017. Those figures have continued to decline in the first half of 2018. The percentage of occupied households with a traditional subscription have declined to less than 72%, down from a high point of 85% recorded in 2009. Virtual multi-channel services, sometimes referred to as vMVPDs, have risen considerably since 2015, offering a thinner package of channels. These services, including DirecTV Now, Sling TV, and Hulu with Live TV, blur the lines between online and traditional services. But it's clear that consumers looking for alternatives have never had more options. At the fore is the programming muscle of Netflix and Amazon Prime Video and the swelling investment in original and acquired content. The investment paves the way for consumers to find alternatives with increasingly fewer sacrifices. However, the legacy providers do have substantial fortifications, including size and reach. There are significant interdependencies with networks and other content, including outright ownership. And in the case of wireline services, they own critical broadband infrastructure. As a result, the video market is still in the early to mid stages of a complex process that shouldn't be oversimplified. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this statement. I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ogleson. Now we'll hear from Mr. Jeff Corwin. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir, for your opening statement.
Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it. Millions of parents, educators, and children rely on the content protected by the Children's Television Act as their most trusted outlet for educational and informational programming. There is an effort underway to dismantle one of the most important public service obligations Congress placed on broadcasters as a condition for their license, serving the needs of children. I speak today not just as a biologist, as a conservationist, explorer, and a father, but also as one of those kids who has benefited from those programs. When I was growing up, my dad worked as a printer by day, delivered Dunkin' Donuts at night, and took classes to become a Boston police officer, for which he served proudly for more than 35 years. My mom worked as a registered nurse at Quincy City Hospital, putting herself through school as well. So my sister and I, we spent a lot of our time in our triple-decker with our black and white TV becoming a bit of a de facto babysitter. Shows like Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins had a powerful impact on introducing me to the natural world and influencing my own life's journey. The TV programs that we make are loaded with that same inspiration, germinating the next generation of innovators, educators, engineers, entrepreneurs, and leaders like yourselves. I've had the good fortune to spend the last 20 years working on shows around the world for Disney, Discovery, Food Network, Animal Planet, CNN, but I'm most proud of the work that I have done with CTA. As we know, our children are naturally curious. They thirst for learning, and our mission is to feed that innate passion, thus inspiring these children to have rewarding and productive futures, which ultimately contributes to our society. Litton's educational programs received more than 1.5 billion views just last year. And this motivates future leaders and visionaries. And many of these begin as children in rural America or in urban environments, often without access to internet technologies. Some of them are, of course, kids that are at-risk teens. The CTA has spurred a virtual classroom filled with incredible teachers and experts that engage millions of children every week. And we do so with enthusiasm, compassion, humor, and this deepens the learning experience. We choose, we intend, our mission is to produce television for teens. We believe providing teens and their families with safe, educational, and inspirational content is vital. Today, when social media and celebrity are often considered more valuable than education and innovation, and when teens are only a single click away from the digital unknown, this programming is more critical than ever. We fear that if the KidVid NPRM is not rectified, stations will no longer dedicate time serving our children, and shows like mine, Ocean Treks, and ABC will be replaced from infomercials such as MyPillow.com. However, we are confident that there is a way for the FCC to provide flexibility for broadcasters without diminishing the quality of programming and Congress's, your commitment to our children. While we support efforts that lessen the burdens on television stations, we strongly oppose broadcasters' move to take the EI programming multicast channel as our primary mode of distribution and rolling back the 3-hour rule. Multicast viewership is 95% less programming carried compared to the primary program stream. Without those viewers, we offer no value to our sponsors and to our advertisers. For example, on the main screen primary format, a commercial would sell for $2,500. On the multicast channel, that commercial is reduced to $25. Congress charged broadcasters with offering educational content for children. In order to stay true to this mission, we must keep our program current. Simple, but if we move the educational program to multicast, original programming will come to an end. It will cease to exist. Our virtual classroom will be obsolete. Broadcast television is uniquely powerful and can be a beacon for inspiration and enlightenment. I ask you, just 2% of broadcast time, is that too much to ask to provide for our children? When Mr. Rogers was here 50 years ago, he discussed the impact that media is having on children, way back then in 1969. Imagine if he was here today, what he would witness with the impact of media, which is why the program we deliver is so vitally important. I thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and I thank all your witnesses, all the witnesses for their testimony today. And before I begin questioning, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record for Mr. Scalise. A letter from the Center for Individual Freedom, Council for Citizens Against Government Waste, and a press release from the National Taxpayers Union. Without objection, so ordered. Now I'd like to begin my questioning. First question will be for Mr. Olgerson. It is very clear that consumers have many different options to get their video content. Can you talk a little bit about how the market is impacted by generational viewing habits? For example, my district is home to many seniors in retirement. Are there certain age groups that are driving subscriber growth or subscriber losses? I know that the youth is probably number one, but if you can explain, I'd appreciate it very much.
Sure. So I think that it is difficult to ascribe a specific demographic to the people that are leaving the multi-channel environment. The common wisdom is that it's younger people, and that part of the decline of multi-channel has to do with younger people leaving a multi-channel service, and the other part has to do with the fact that they're not fueling new subscribers as older subscribers churn off. We have seen certainly survey evidence of younger people embracing over-the-top video more frequently than older people. If we look at a recent survey, it shows that that the seniors, sort of over 72 years old, tend to be more engaged with multi-channel services. They tend to be less engaged with the subscriber VOD services like Netflix. And so we certainly have that evidence. We've also seen that both younger generations like Gen Z and millennials tend to be about the same, have the same satisfaction rate with their multi-channel services as seniors, which is an interesting fact, an interesting finding. But seniors seem to find more value within those multi-channel services. So we have seen a senior class that tends to stay closer to the multi-channel services than their younger demographics.
I think a follow-up here. How are content creators and video providers adapting to these changes?
Are they adapting to the changes?
How are they adapting to these changes?
Well, I think that we've certainly seen the multi-channel service providers like Comcast, Charter, integrating their own access to over-the-top features. We've seen them introduce, on a limited basis, their own skinny bundles. Comcast has its Instant TV initiative, which is meant to look and feel similar to a virtual service like a Hulu with live TV. So we've seen that. They've invested in improved user interfaces to try to match some of the functionality that they get from Netflix. So we've seen a variety of different offerings from operators.
Thank you. Our next question is for Mr. Moffett. You talked in your testimony about a transition to closed media, with more and more content owners moving to a closed system like Netflix or Hulu. But consumers must have individual subscriptions with all of these providers. That's correct, right? Which leads to the question of subscription fatigue. Do you have any thoughts on this, how the industry can respond to the overload of subscriptions as we move to a closed system?
Mr. Chairman, it's a fantastic question, and the answer is I think the entire industry writ large is grappling with exactly that question. You know, Disney, for example, has talked about an expectation that they will increasingly be a direct-to-consumer company. HBO is increasingly, or in fact, arguably always has been to some degree, a direct-to-consumer company, as is to a degree Showtime. But all of them are in effect aiming at becoming direct-to-consumer platforms that will increasingly look like closed systems, as by the way will Netflix, where Netflix is licensing less content, certainly as a share of its total business, from others and producing more and more of it themselves. So the question of what the future looks like, it's very hard for us to get our heads around the idea that we might have a model where at AT&T, for example, the only way you would be able to get CNN is if you were a subscriber to an AT&T platform and you ended up with an exclusivity platform like that, or the only way you could get NBC would be to be a subscriber to Comcast, and that if you had to choose between the two, it would mean I'm either going to have one or the other, because adding them together may be rather unwieldy. That is so different than the model that we've all grown up with that most people find it to be almost unimaginable. But in effect, all of the competitors of the traditional companies are going in that direction. And so what the traditional companies are struggling with is, are we going to be forced to go in that direction as well? And I don't think anybody has a good answer yet for what that looks like, how many subscriptions the average person is likely to be willing to bear. Those are all very, very open questions at this point.
All right, thank you very much. My time has expired. Now I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Doyle.
Yeah. Mr. Corwin, as I understand it, TV stations contract Litton, who you're testifying on behalf of, to provide them with children's television content to meet their KidVid obligations, right? And the way that Litton pays to produce new content is by selling advertisements during these broadcasts, right?
Yes.
So now one part of the FCC's proposal regarding KidVid is to allow broadcasters to meet that KidVid obligation by broadcasting this content on one of their multicast stations. Now, I've heard that there's a pretty significant difference in value between main station and multicast advertising revenue. Is that accurate? And if so, how big of a difference are we talking about?
Well, there's a tremendous challenge with trying to rely on multicast as a way to broadcast, but I could tell you, from my personal experience, I find that people are very excited to be engaged in this material, and I hope that none of your constituents are responding to you saying they're getting too much educational television.
Right, but what I'm interested in is what's the difference in the advertising revenues, whether they are broadcast?
They're huge. The advertising revenue can be from $2,000 plus per commercial to $25. Why does that break down so much? Well, that's because you lose your audience. Multicast is not available on cable. It's not available on satellite. It's rarely broadcasted in HD. We lose 98% of the market. My own children, where I live in Massachusetts, would not be able to watch my television program.
So then my question is, do you think that you and other content producers could continue to make high-quality children's television content for broadcasters under KidVid if you were just working with ad revenue from multicast stations?
We could not. In fact, what we do is we actually generate our own income and which the networks do not have to pay for. We are self-sustaining, but because we would no longer have the marketplace, would no longer have the viewership, would no longer be competitive, and we wouldn't get those ad dollars. The reason why I get the money to make the TV shows that we do is by having a strong, robust, highly competitive viewing audience, and that goes away on multicast.
Well, representing the district where Fred Rogers lived, I'll ask you, do you think there's value in children having access to safe educational original programming on free over-the-air broadcast television?
I do. There are millions of children that get this information. I can tell you, Mr. Doyle, I was filming in Pennsylvania just a couple of weeks ago, filming the hellbender, which is a remarkable species of salamander that tells us all about science, technology, and research, both in the ancient past of evolution and today in modern wildlife management. We get to tell that story in a compelling way through my TV show because we have the budget to be able to travel and invest in these stories. That goes away through multicast.
Yeah, well, I agree that I think there's great benefit to having that kind of program over the air on free television. And I just close by saying I'm glad that Pirates don't have to play the Red Sox this year. So, Mr. Chairman, I know we have votes being called, so I'll yield back.
Okay. We're going to get one more in. We'll get I'll recognize the full chairman of the committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks to our witnesses. This is part of a very vibrant discussion we're going to be having on this committee in the weeks and months and probably years ahead about the changing video marketplace and what it looks like, what it can look like, what it will look like, what we can envision it should be, and then what are the regulations in place today? Do they make sense for today? Do they make sense for tomorrow? Who's covered, who's not? These were always the challenges in public policy we get confronted with. I loved Wild Kingdom too. You know, it was on the air from I think it was 1963 to 1988. And we always watched it. Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. They got that little advertising plug in there every time. I think KidVid actually came in 1990. So the law that you referenced actually was enacted in 1990. And I guess as I look at this marketplace, gosh, there's never been more opportunities for all kinds of programming at your fingertips as long as you have connectivity and internet. So it's a pretty exciting time, unless you're stuck on your brick phone. Yeah, I know, yeah. So, Mr. Moffett, critics of, yeah, he's still paying for AOL, too. Mr. Moffett, critics of industry consolidation, could we have order here, Mr. Chairman? Critics of industry consolidation have claimed that the combination of large firms who provide both content and distribution platforms is anti-competitive and puts too much power in the hands of a few. But we don't often talk about the impact that new entrants are having on the same marketplace. Google's YouTube platform is the largest video network in the world, and it is enhanced by 2 billion Android phone devices that come pre-installed with the YouTube app. Amazon's Prime reaches 2/3 of American households now, and both of these companies have market caps several times larger than the biggest telecom media companies. Can you comment on big tech's increasing presence in the video market and how this impacts competition?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Look, it is very clear that the moves that you've seen from companies like AT&T and Comcast have been precisely to respond to the fact that the scale and market power of companies like Google and Facebook are in fact much greater than their own. And what I described in my witness statement of a model that, or what an economist would call the monetization theory, based on advertising and you know, the old adage that if the product is free, you're the product.
Right.
In fact, the consumer is the product that is
Right.
being sold in most of these
'Cause
models.
it's data.
They may not be entirely free, but all of the economic value is effectively predicated on the assumption that there will be a resale of the customer data, what you watch and what you do. That is extraordinarily difficult for the traditional companies to respond to. And what you're seeing is a sort of a different model. The consolidation is more defensive than offensive among the large companies. They're trying to respond by doing the traditional things of getting bigger and cutting cost. And hoping, in the case of AT&T, that there is a path for them to be truly competitive as an advertising platform. But it is very difficult for them as a competence to be as successful in the advertising business as the digital advertisers, Facebook and Google in particular, are.
And you've talked about the rise of virtual MVPDs and how they're becoming popular with consumers, but you said the service is losing money, so it may not be sustainable, but yet it seems like Wall Street has supported business models that lose money as long as they keep growing their user base. I think about Amazon and Snapchat and the way they leverage their capital to keep garnering market share. It's phenomenal what they've done in so many respects. Do you think Wall Street will give virtual MVPDs the same benefit, or does a different set of rules apply?
Well, I think for now, the Wall Street is generally skeptical of the virtual MVPD model, at least the live version. That's distinct from the Netflix model. So the Netflix model, which is in Wall Street parlance an SVOD model, or subscription video on demand, particularly when they're producing their own content, it's a fixed cost being amortized across a larger and larger base.
Right.
By contrast, the virtual MVPDs are essentially a variable cost. And so if you lose money on one customer, having 100 million customers is still going to lose money. You're losing money on every
You don't
one,
make it up on volume.
So scale doesn't help. And so Wall Street is quite skeptical, I think, for the moment, of any of the virtual MVPD models. In the context of a company like Google, YouTube TV is too small for anyone to spend much time on it. But a big part of the reason, for example, that AT&T as an equity has performed so poorly since its DirecTV acquisition isn't just that DirecTV started to shrink right after they bought it, but because they started to migrate customers into a virtual MVPD of their own, DirecTV Now, that was hemorrhaging money. And so the income statement looked, frankly, quite awful, partly because of that acquisition. So Wall Street has not been willing to fund the expansion of the traditional companies into this business.
Right.
I've
gone over my
and hasn't paid much attention to the digital companies doing it.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now you back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And now we'll recognize the ranking member, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that we have a vote on, so I'm going to only use about half the time, and I'm going to limit my questions to Mr. Corwin. I want to thank you for your excellent programming that you provided to America's children over the years. And I agree with you that my concern that you share is that the FCC, in considering rolling back protections that ensure kids have access to free educational informational TV program, is a serious problem. So let me just say, if educational children's program migrated online or to cable channel only, what groups of children would be the most affected?
Would be the people most affected are the ones that do not have access to the technology. And as we've discovered with the potential opportunities of multicast is that there's no opportunity for broadcast because we just wouldn't have our audience. So unless you're in a public library or you're at a school, there are many children in our country that would not have access to this technology.
And what's the consequence of that? In other words, children from lower income homes, as you say, have access to fewer resources and opportunities than wealthier families. So in your experience, you know, how does exposure to educational program mandated by KidVid rules actually benefit the children?
So how does it benefit children? Okay, so the only thing I could say is, in my job, I don't wear a suit. This is the first time I've worn a suit. I always say you never want to see me in a suit because you're probably in a casket. But I needed a suit. I was filming overseas. My wife got a suit. I came home. It didn't fit. And I couldn't find a tailor. I found a tailor at the last minute. She was able to do it. I didn't think she knew who I was. I got a text for her saying, you can pick it up on the 26th in the afternoon. And she said, by the way, I don't know if this is inappropriate, but would you provide a correspondence to my nephew because he serves in special ops, and he wanted you to know that when he was a teenager, he was going through some tough times, and your programming and others inspired him to focus, and he joined the military. Now has a very productive career. I mean, that's a personal story that I've encountered. I've met many children I've met many, unfortunately, now that I'm aging, you meet adults that come up to you say, I became a veterinarian or I became a scientist because of shows like yours that I've experienced. So on a personal note, I've met hundreds, if not thousands of people that have been positively impacted. When it comes to our natural resources, I'll tell you this, you can't protect and you can't wisely use what you do not love. And if you don't love it, you'll never love it if you never realize it or discover it. And that's what shows like mine do. We provide a vehicle, a safe, encouraging, rich environment for young children and young people to make discoveries that could perhaps set them on the careers of what they will do in the future.
I think that's so important. And, you know, the other thing we realize more and more, or at least I do, I think most people do, is that when you talk about STEM, right, in other words, you know, science, engineering, the things that kind of education that's so important, you know, for the future in a sort of innovative technology world, what this committee deals with, that's where a lot of these kids, we know that in, you know, STEM education is something that low-income kids often don't have the opportunity to, don't hear about, don't start, you know, wondering about science and nature and all that. And so I think it has a particular impact there, because I worry so much that, you know, the people from low-income backgrounds will never get into those fields. And the sort of discovery aspect that you're talking about, I think, is particularly important in that respect as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for yielding back, and now I'll recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Louisiana, my good friend, Mr. Scalise. 5 minutes, please.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the testimony that y'all have given and really described just how much things have changed since the brick was the cell phone. This was the last time our laws were written. These are the laws. We're literally operating under 1992 laws with this technology. And I show this to show the importance of why we need to update our laws. And, you know, obviously I filed a bill, the Next Generation Television Marketplace, to start this conversation about how we get beyond these people that want to live in the dark ages. The number one song, by the way, when the 1992 Cable Act was written, ironically, was End of the Road by Boys to Men. It is the end of the road for the 92 Cable Act, but we can't keep living under it because those companies that are fighting that change. Mr. Moffett, you said in your statement earlier, change or get left behind. And really that's fitting, because it seems like some of the people that think that they're protected by the 92 Cable Act, that want to hide behind the 92 Cable Act and fight to protect it, they're going to fight change while they're getting left behind, because the change is happening. The problem is you have very different sets of rules that everybody's playing by. Why is it, and I think Mr. Olgerson, you did some research to look at how many people are really cutting the cord, what kind of drop there is. And from what I saw, there's about a 9% reduction in people that are staying within the old MVPD marketplace. In other words, the cutting of the cord is real, and they're doing it, but they're not just stopping and watching things. They're transferring over to over the top. And I think in your studies, it was somewhere around 180% increase in the number of people going to over the top. And so there was a revenue study that was done by Convergence Research Group that showed a revenue change last year. A 1% increase in pay TV, the traditional MVPD, and a 41% increase in revenues by over the top. The more alarming part for the traditional revenue, the traditional MVPD folks, you know, while they may be saying, hey, we had a 1% increase, that's a decrease in what they were getting before, but they're losing customers by a rapid rate. And so if you look at where we should be trying to go, we should be trying to go to a marketplace where everybody has the same set of rules. One of the reasons that those traditional MVPDs can't go find ways to get more customers that are getting better choices. I mean, customers do what they always do. They look for better choices and they look for lower costs. And they're finding both in the over the top, but they can't get it in the traditional MVPD because there are laws in the 92 Cable Act, like must carry, like basic tier. There are actual laws that prevent you from providing the services that customers are looking for. So they're cutting the cord because they can go somewhere else. So Mr. Moffett, what I want to ask you is, as I've described that marketplace, explain to me maybe why you see some of these traditional MVPDs fighting change that frankly, the change, they're going to be Blockbuster. You know, Chairman Walden, I know he gave that example of Blockbuster. Blockbuster died for a reason, because they fought the change that was happening. It happened anyway. And so as people moved away, Blockbuster went away because they fought the change. If they maybe would have said, let's go be like Netflix, then maybe they could be like Netflix today instead of being the dinosaur. So if you want to maybe touch on that, Mr. Moffett.
Well, thank you for the question. And I would say, in fact, part of the reason that the change has seemed, particularly to people in the tech community, has seemed a bit glacial for the traditionals, is precisely as you say. There are very real limitations on their degrees of freedom, right? As a traditional MVPD, a Comcast or a Charter or something, I might want to, for example, respond to the emergence of so-called skinny bundles among the OTT players by saying, well, I have to have skinnier bundles of my own with fewer networks. Well, your contracts don't allow that, so you probably can't.
And maybe that worked when you were the monopoly. Again, in 1992, you didn't even have satellite. Stella didn't exist. You surely didn't have Roku and Hulu and all those other services. You had one place to go, and you were the only game in town, and so it was a great relationship with the networks. They were a monopoly, you were a monopoly, and everybody could only go to you.
And by the
that
way,
doesn't exist anymore.
And the negotiating leverage, as you can imagine, in those days was quite different. One of the challenges for the traditional MVPDs in competing is, as they think about the retrans rules, for example, you have a very clear asymmetry in the negotiating leverage. The media company, the local, I should say, the local broadcast affiliate, particularly in NFL markets where they have the rights to a local football game, is dealing with a product that for which there is no substitute. By law, there is no one else allowed to sell that NFL game, for example, in that market. And they're negotiating with a player on the multi-channel video side, a cable operator or a satellite operator, for whom there are very obvious and identifiable substitutes. So that's quite different than the situation in 1992, and not surprisingly.
And I apologize, I know I'm out of time, but just to say, to wrap it up, Mr. Chairman, let's get back to a free market where everybody's paid for their content. I mean, let's go to pure copyright. We're not talking about somebody giving away their product for free. But no, let's not have the government tell you that you have to provide content one way, but this other actor over here that's going through the internet can operate in a completely different set of rules and environment and take your customers away, but you're trapped in the old system. Let's have a free market for everybody where you get fully compensated for your content, but update the laws, because my gosh, why are we still operating under these laws? It's the end of the road. Yield back.
All right, thank you, Mr. Scalise. And as you know, votes have been called, so we'll take a slight recess. The subcommittee will recess for, well, a few minutes.